12 years at sea taught me that true freedom comes at a price. The salty taste of the sea breeze was swapped for the fresh mountain air of Idaho, where I finally found my own piece of land. With my grandfather's inheritance and years of saving up, I built a sustainable cabin in the last preserved valley of the region. Solar panels, a rainwater collection system, and a small organic garden, all meticulously planned during my long trips as a Navy engineer. The sound of birds replaced the ship sirens, and the isolation I'd long sought seemed perfect. But on that October morning, when I saw that black SUV coming up my dirt road, I realized that my dream of peace was about to turn into a nightmare. Patricia Anderson was about to turn my life into a war I never chose to fight. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get more stories like this. When Patricia Anderson stepped out of the car in her impeccable blazer and leather briefcase, I could tell she completely didn't belong in this rustic setting. Behind her, two men with military bearing stayed close to the vehicle, watching my every move. "Mr. Barrett, your property now falls under the Clear Ridge HOA," she declared, handing over a folder full of documents. "We need to discuss some necessary changes to your residence." The tone of disdain in her voice when referring to my cabin was unmistakable. I explained that my land wasn't part of any association. I'd checked all the paperwork before buying it, and the title was clean. Patricia smiled. That smile bankers give when they're about to take something that isn't theirs. "Things have changed, Mr. Barrett. This area was recently incorporated into our association. Your solar installations violate our aesthetic guidelines, and that garden, well, it doesn't meet our standards. 12 years in the Navy taught me to stay calm under pressure." I took the documents and told her my lawyer would review them. Patricia adjusted her blazer and shot a look at my cabin that made my spine tingle. "You have 1 week to bring your property into compliance or face severe fines. Clear Ridge has a reputation to uphold." She turned and walked back to the car, her heels sinking slightly into the soft earth. Before leaving, she added, "Oh, and those solar panels need to be removed by Friday." I watched the car vanish down the dirt road, knowing that visit was just the start of something much bigger. In the following weeks, the pressure gradually increased. It started with warning letters, then absurd fines for violations that didn't even exist. Every morning brought a new threat in my mailbox. $500 for the organic garden, $1,000 for the solar panels, $750 for improper maintenance of the facade. Patricia's men began to show up at random hours. They parked on the road in front of my property, took pictures, and made notes. One night, while I was working on my laptop, headlights illuminated my windows. 3 black SUVs pulled into my property. 6 men got out, all wearing uniforms from Clear Ridge Security. "Night inspection," announced one of them, a tall guy with a scar on his face. I recognized his bearing, a former soldier, like me. But unlike me, he chose to use his training to intimidate civilians. I refused them access to my property. They insisted, citing regulations I knew were bogus. When I turned my back to go inside, I distinctly heard a gun being cocked. My years of service made me instantly recognize that click. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Barrett," said the scarred man. "We're just doing our job." Slowly, I turned around. "Your job doesn't include pointing guns at rightful property owners. You don't have any authority here." My security camera was recording everything. I had installed a full system after Patricia's first visit. Years in the Navy taught me to always have a contingency plan. They eventually left, but not before one of them accidentally broke 2 of my solar panels with his baton. The next morning, I found a new fine, $2,000 for damaged equipment in a common area. While I was cleaning up the glass shards from the panels, I realized I needed to change my strategy. It wasn't just about my house or my dream of freedom anymore. It was about stopping people like Patricia Anderson from destroying everything in their path in the name of profit and power. I grabbed my phone and called Nathan Thompson, the lawyer who had helped me buy the property. It was time to fight back. Nathan listened intently as I showed him the camera recordings and the fine documents in his office. His eyebrows raised when he saw the video from the night inspection. "This is criminal harassment, Jackson. Patricia is using tactics I've seen in other cases of corrupt HOAs, but she's taken it to a whole new level." Nathan picked up his favorite pen and started taking notes. "What worries me is the timing. Why now? This area has never had an HOA before." I handed him an envelope I'd come across in my research. "Maybe this explains it. These are plans for a luxury resort. Clear Ridge isn't just an HOA, it's a front for a development company. They're buying up or forcing owners out all over the valley." Nathan examined the documents and nodded slowly. "That explains a lot. Your property is strategic. It controls access to the spring that would supply the resort. Without your land, their project isn't viable. And what about the other owners? I asked. Most have either sold or been intimidated into leaving. You're the last obstacle. Nathan opened his notebook. Check this out. In the past 6 months, Clear Ridge has recorded land acquisitions all over the valley. The pattern is always the same. First threats, then astronomical fines, and finally, the debt is executed. While Nathan was talking, Sheriff Richard Cooper entered the office. I had filed several police reports, but until now, I hadn't gotten any results. Mr. Barrett, Cooper said, removing his hat. We finally have something concrete on Patricia Anderson. 3 former owners have come forward with stories similar to yours. And there's more. We've discovered links between Clear Ridge and a shell company investigated for real estate fraud in other states. We need more, said Nathan. If we're going to take down Patricia, we need to prove that the HOA documents are fraudulent. I can help with that, Cooper replied. An employee at the registry noticed some irregularities in the registration dates. Some documents appear to have been backdated. At that moment, my phone buzzed. It was a text message. Last chance, Barrett. $500K for your property, or things are going to get really ugly. You have 24 hours. I showed the message to Nathan and Cooper. The sheriff immediately started tracking the number, while Nathan grinned for the first time that day. That's perfect, he said. It's exactly the coercion evidence we needed. Jackson, I want you to respond. Set up a meeting with them. For what? I asked. Because, Nathan replied as he grabbed his phone. I'm calling in some FBI friends. Patricia Anderson isn't the only one who knows how to set an ambush. I left the office with a plan in motion, and for the first time in weeks I felt I had a real shot at winning. But as I drove back home, I couldn't help but notice 2 black SUVs trailing at a distance. The war was far from over, and the next 24 hours would be decisive. The meeting was set for sunset, on my property. FBI agents were strategically positioned in the forest around, and Sheriff Cooper was coordinating the operation from his vehicle, hidden about half a kilometer down the road. Right on time at 6, the familiar black SUV pulled up my driveway. Patricia got out first, followed by 4 of her security guards. The scarred man carried a briefcase that, I suspected, held much more than papers. I see that you've finally come to your senses, said Patricia, her artificial smile gleaming in the twilight. You brought over the transfer documents. Just sign, and the money will be wired immediately. Not so fast, I replied. I want to see the original HOA documents. The ones that prove my property is under your jurisdiction. Patricia hesitated for a moment. I didn't bring that documentation. It's not relevant to today's transaction. It is relevant, I insisted. Because according to the registry, those documents were backdated. That makes me question their authenticity. Patricia's smile vanished. She made a subtle gesture to her men, who began to form a semicircle around me. Mr. Barrett, don't complicate things. $500K is a generous offer for this piece of land. She practically spat the last words. Don't force me to use other methods. Intimidation, violence, or maybe document fraud? I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and showed her the screen. It's all recorded, Patricia. Every threat, every intrusion, every extortion attempt. The scarred man stepped forward, his hand moving toward his holster. But Patricia stopped him with a gesture. You don't understand, do you? She laughed, but her eyes were ice cold. It doesn't matter what you think you've recorded. I have judges, politicians, and business people on my side. Your little word against an empire. Actually, said a voice from the darkness, he's got a lot more than that. Nathan Thompson emerged from the shadows, followed by FBI agents and Sheriff Cooper. In seconds, Patricia's security men were disarmed and handcuffed. Patricia Anderson, announced one of the agents. You are under arrest for fraud, extortion, document forgery, and conspiracy. As the agents read her rights, Patricia kept her eyes fixed on me. You have no idea what you just did. Powerful people had a stake in that project. And now they'll want nothing to do with you, I replied. The documents we found at the registry led to a trail of fraud in 3 different states. Your empire is finished. I watched as they led her away, her once haughty demeanor finally broken. Nathan came up and placed a hand on my shoulder. It isn't over yet, he said. We still have to dismantle the whole structure of Clear Ridge and make sure this never happens again. I know, I replied, looking toward my cabin, the damaged solar panels glinting under the fading light. But for the first time in months, I can sleep knowing my land is safe. Sheriff Cooper stepped forward with a smile. Well, I guess now you really earned your peace, son. The following months were intense. The case against Patricia Anderson opened a Pandora's box of corruption and real estate fraud. Dozens of owners who'd been forced to sell their lands began coming forward, each with a story much like mine. Nathan's office became an operations center for a collective action. Maps covered the walls, showing Clear Ridge's predatory pattern all over the state. Patricia wasn't lying about her connections. The investigation revealed a network of crooked judges, bought-off politicians, and unscrupulous businessmen. On a cold winter morning, I sat in the front row of the courtroom to testify. Patricia looked unrecognizable in her prison uniform, her arrogance replaced by a controlled anger. When I detailed every incident, every threat, every night of fear in my own home, I saw something in her eyes that I'd never seen before: defeat. The trial lasted 3 weeks. In the end, Patricia was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Clear Ridge was dissolved, its assets frozen and later used to compensate the victims. The scarred man and the other guards got lighter sentences for intimidation and illegal weapons possession. But the real victory came later. Nathan and I worked with state legislators to draft the Barrett Act, a law that set strict protections against predatory practices by HOAs and developers. My little battle for a piece of land in the Idaho mountains had grown into something much bigger. 6 months after the trial, I organized a gathering on my property. Families from all over the valley came, people who had regained their lands, others who could finally build homes without fear. Under the newly installed solar panels, we shared stories and planned for the future. "You know what's ironic?" Nathan said, while we watched the kids playing near the expanded garden. "Patricia wanted to turn this valley into an exclusive resort. Now, thanks to you, it turned into something much better, a real community." He was right. The people who returned to the valley brought different skills and dreams. One family started a solar energy cooperative inspired by my setup. Another group opened an organic market. We were building something that no amount of money could buy. The last time I visited Patricia in prison, she looked smaller, older. "Why did you come?" she asked in a hoarse voice. "To thank you," I replied. "Your greed taught us the value of unity. Your resort project showed us what really mattered to preserve." I left the prison and drove back home, watching the valley that now flourished with life and purpose. My cabin was no longer alone on the mountain. It was surrounded by a community of people who, like me, had learned to fight for what they believed in. At night, sitting on my porch, I still hear the sound of birds, but now mixed with distant laughter and the soft murmur of a living community. The isolation I once sought has been replaced by something far more precious: a sense of belonging and shared purpose. 5 years passed since the events with Patricia Anderson. The valley had become a living example of how a community can thrive when people join together for a common purpose. Our small solar energy cooperative now provides electricity to 3 neighboring counties, and our organic products fair has become a regional benchmark. On an autumn morning, while I was having coffee on the porch, I saw an unfamiliar car driving up the road. For a moment, old reflexes made me tense up, but those days of apprehension were behind me. It was a young reporter from the Seattle Times, interested in doing a story on how the valley had transformed. "It's incredible," she said, snapping photos of the sustainable houses scattered along the slope, each one respecting the natural environment. "How did you manage to balance development with preservation?" I showed her our latest achievement, a community center built with sustainable techniques, where we held workshops on renewable energy and organic farming. In the main hall, a wall showcased photos of our journey, including that fateful night when Patricia was arrested. "The Barrett Act changed everything," I explained. "Not just here, but throughout the state. We get monthly visits from people wanting to replicate our model in their communities." As we walked, we met Nathan, who now lived in the valley. He had transformed his law office into a center for legal assistance for communities facing situations like ours. "You know what's even more ironic?" Nathan said to the reporter. "The resort Patricia planned would never have generated half the revenue that our cooperative community brings in today. And best of all, the money stays here, benefiting local people." Sheriff Cooper, about to retire, joined us for our weekly community lunch. "I remember when they thought this valley was dead," he commented. "Now it's the liveliest place I know." In the afternoon, I took the reporter to the viewpoint where you could see the entire valley. Sustainable houses dotted the landscape, blending with nature. Community gardens flourished among the buildings. Solar panels shone in the sun, silent symbols of our energy independence. "But you know what's most important?" I told her. "It's not the buildings or the systems we've put in place. It's the trust. When Patricia tried to destroy us, she accidentally taught us to trust one another. Before leaving, the reporter asked one final question. "Have you heard anything about Patricia since she got out?" "She was released last year," I replied. "Ironically, the last I heard is that she's been doing consulting for sustainable communities in another state. Maybe she learned something after all." At night, after the reporter left, I sat again on my porch. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky orange and purple. Familiar sounds filled the air. Children playing in the new recreation area. Soft music coming from the community center. The bell from the chapel some residents had built. My search for solitude had led me to something far more precious. A true community. The cabin was still my refuge, but now it was part of something larger. We'd created not just a place to live, but a way of life that others wanted to follow. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory over Patricia Anderson and everything she stood for. 10 years after that decisive night, our valley became an international case study in sustainable development and community resilience. Universities sent their students to learn from our experience, and delegations from other countries visited regularly to understand how to replicate our model. One special afternoon, we gathered all the residents to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Barrett Act. The community center was decorated with photos from our journey, from the dark days of the black SUVs to the moments of triumph and collective building. Nathan, now with graying hair but the same determined sparkle in his eyes, took the makeshift stage. 10 years ago, we were fighting for our homes. Today, we've built something money can't buy, a true community. Sheriff Cooper, now retired but still a respected figure in the valley, raised his glass in a toast. To the courage of a man who refused to be bullied, and to the wisdom of all who turned that struggle into something bigger than themselves. Surprisingly, among the guests was a familiar face, the scarred man, now transformed after serving his time. He came up to me, eyes lowered. "It took me a long time to understand what you were protecting here," he said. "I'm sorry for the part I played back then." Watching the celebration, I realized that our victory wasn't just over greed and corruption. It was a victory of vision over blindness, of community over predatory individualism, of sustainable futures over immediate profit. My little cabin is still there, a bit more weathered by time, but now surrounded by community gardens and embraced by a family much larger than I'd ever imagined. The solar panels, once targets of vandalism, are now part of a network that fuels dreams and possibilities. At night, as the valley lights softly twinkle under the stars, I still wonder about the strange paths life takes. I came here seeking solitude and ended up finding purpose. I came to build a house and helped build a community. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get more stories like this. The legacy of our valley continues to expand in ways we never could have imagined. On the 15th anniversary of the Barrett Act, we received surprising news. Our story would be made into a documentary by an award-winning filmmaker. During filming, old memories were revisited. Every interview revealed a new perspective of our journey. The most touching moment was seeing the children of the residents, now teenagers, talking about growing up in a community that was born out of resistance and flourished through cooperation. "The valley isn't just a place," said Sarah, the daughter of one of the first residents to return after Patricia's downfall. "It's living proof that there's an alternative to predatory development." The impact of the Barrett Act stretched far beyond our borders. Dozens of communities across the country adopted our legislation and development model. The law that was born from our struggle now protects thousands of families. In one particularly significant scene of the documentary, I returned to Nathan's office, now turned into a living museum of community resistance. The walls still held the maps and documents from that time, preserving the memory of our battle. "Every mark on these walls tells a story," I explained to the camera. "Not just a story of struggle, but of transformation, of how fear can turn into strength when people unite." The filmmaker also captured the practical aspects of our victory: thriving community gardens, schools that integrated sustainability into the curriculum, renewable energy programs that turned our region into a model of energy independence. But perhaps the most powerful moment was when we gathered 3 generations of residents for a photo in front of my old cabin. There were the veterans of the original battle, their children who grew up building the community, and now their grandchildren, heirs to a legacy of resistance and hope. What started as a fight for a piece of land, I narrated for the documentary, turned into an example of how we can live differently. It's not just about resisting greed and exploitation. It's about building something better in its place. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get more stories like this. 10 years after that decisive night, our valley has become an international case study in sustainable development and community resilience. Universities send their students to learn from our experience, and delegations from other countries visit regularly to understand how to replicate our model. One special afternoon, we gathered all the residents to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Barrett Act. The community center was adorned with photos from our journey, from the dark days of the black SUVs to moments of triumph and building together. Nathan, now with graying hair but the same determined spark in his eyes, took the makeshift stage. 10 years ago, we were fighting for our homes. Today, we've built something money can't buy, a true community. Sheriff Cooper, now retired but still a respected figure in the valley, raised his glass in a toast. To the courage of a man who refused to be intimidated, and to the wisdom of all who turned that fight into something bigger than themselves. Surprisingly, among the guests was a familiar face, the scarred man, now a changed person after serving his time. He came up to me, his eyes downcast. "It took me a long time to understand what you were protecting here," he said. "I apologize for the part I played back then." Watching the celebration, I realized our victory wasn't just over greed and corruption. It was a victory of vision over ignorance, of community over predatory individualism, of a sustainable future over quick profit. My humble cabin is still standing, a bit more worn by time, but now surrounded by community gardens and embraced by a family much larger than I'd ever imagined. The solar panels, once targets of vandalism, now form part of a network that fuels dreams and possibilities. At night, as the valley lights softly glow under the stars, I still wonder about the curious paths life takes. I came seeking solitude and found purpose instead. I came to build a home and ended up building a community. 15 years after that decisive night, our valley has become an international case study in sustainable development and community resistance. Universities send their students to learn from our experience, and delegations from other countries visit regularly to understand how to replicate our model. On a special afternoon, we gathered all the residents to celebrate the 15th anniversary of the Barrett Act. The community center was adorned with photos of our journey, from the dark days of the black SUVs to our triumphant moments of collective building. Nathan, now sporting graying hair but still with that determined sparkle in his eyes, took the makeshift stage. 15 years ago, we fought for our homes. Today, we've built something money can't buy, a true community. Sheriff Cooper, now retired but still a respected figure around here, raised his glass in a toast. To the courage of a man who refused to back down, and to the wisdom of everyone who turned that fight into something bigger than themselves. Surprisingly, among the guests was a familiar face, the scarred man who had transformed after serving his time. He came over to me, looking downcast. "It took me a long time to understand what you were protecting here," he said, "and I'm sorry for my role back then." Watching the celebration, I realized our victory wasn't just against greed and corruption. It was a triumph of vision over ignorance, of community over predatory individualism, and of a sustainable future over immediate profit. My little cabin is still there, a bit more worn with time, but now surrounded by community gardens and embraced by a far larger family than I ever imagined. The solar panels, once vandalized, are now part of a network that fuels dreams and possibilities. At night, as the valley lights glow softly under the stars, I can't help but ponder the curious paths life takes. I came in search of solitude and found purpose instead. I came to build a house and ended up building a community. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get more stories like this. The legacy of our valley keeps expanding in ways we never could have predicted. On the 15th anniversary of the Barrett Act, we received some surprising news. Our story was going to be turned into a documentary by an award-winning filmmaker. During filming, old memories were revisited. Every interview revealed a new angle on our journey. The most touching moment was watching the children of the residents, now teenagers, talk about growing up in a community born of resistance and flowering through cooperation. "The valley isn't just a place," said Sarah, the daughter of one of the first residents to return after Patricia's downfall. "It's living proof that there's an alternative to predatory development." The impact of the Barrett Act went far beyond our borders. Dozens of communities across the nation have adopted our legislation and model. The law that emerged from our struggle now protects thousands of families. In one especially significant scene of the documentary, I returned to Nathan's office, now turned into a living museum of community resistance. The walls still bear the maps and documents from those days, preserving the memory of our battle. "Every mark on these walls tells a story," I explained to the camera. "Not just a story of struggle, but of transformation, of how fear can turn into strength when people come together. The filmmaker also captured the practical side of our victory: flourishing community gardens, schools integrating sustainability into their curriculum, and renewable energy programs that have made our region a model of energy independence. But perhaps the most powerful moment was when we gathered 3 generations of residents for a photo in front of my old cabin. There were veterans of the original battle, their children who grew up building the community, and now their grandchildren, the heirs of a legacy of resistance and hope. What began as a fight for a piece of land, I narrated for the documentary, became an example of how we can live differently. It's not just about resisting greed and exploitation, but about building something better in its place. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get more stories like this.